So we start perfectly on time. Dear colleagues, welcome everyone. It is a great honor today for me to introduce to you Lord Norman Foster, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th and 21st centuries. Norman Foster is founder and executive chairman of Foster & Partners, a global studio for architecture, urbanism, and design rooted in sustainability. Over more than 5 decades, the practice has pioneered a sustainable approach to architecture and urbanism through a wide range of work, from master plans to offices, cultural buildings, airports, and industrial design. He has been awarded architecture's highest accolades, including the Pritzker Architecture Prize, the Premio Imperiale Award for Architecture in Japan, the RIBA Royal Gold Medal, and the AIA Gold Medal. He is president of the Norman Foster Foundation based in Madrid. And in 1999, he was honored with a life peerage, becoming Lord Foster of Thames Bank. This is a historic moment for us. To meet a celebrity like Norman Foster is truly extraordinary privilege. It would take too long to describe all the masterpieces that Norman Foster has created, but today we are talking about encounters. I must say that although I too met Lord Foster for the first time today, in reality, throughout my life, I've had many encounters with these masterpieces, starting from my readings as I was a young man. My studies led me to discover the projects of the world's greatest architects, and Norman Foster's works were the most captivating and fascinating of all. Then there are the experiences that I lived in person. I remember that in Barcelona, I lived in a neighborhood from which I could see the Collserola Tower, a masterpiece, an example of almost science fiction-like architecture. It looked like an object landed from space. During the period I worked in Germany, I had my office furnished with an enormous table. It was a piece of an unparalleled technological and futuristic beauty. Working at that desk made my days better. Then there was my visit to the Reichstag in Berlin, where Norman Foster was commissioned to build the famous dome. It is an extremely symbolic structure, beautiful from an architectural and artistic perspective, and incredibly intriguing in terms of the solutions adopted. I must admit that Norman Foster's projects often are a source of inspiration for us designers, a way to envision the future. An example of this is the Ferrari F80 that you saw downstairs, a supercar that aims to capture the essence of a very ambitious project and did so with an architectural and futuristic approach. This brings me to a statement by Lord Foster, one in particular that is as relevant as meaningful for us at Ferrari. As an architect, you design for the present with an awareness of the past for a future which is essentially unknown. Now, I welcome Lord Norman Foster, thank him for accepting our invitation, and give him the floor.
Thank you. New York today is like New York in the 30s. It's a collection of individual buildings, and those individual buildings collectively make up the city. But there are really two worlds, the world of the architecture of the individual building and the urbanism, you could call it the urban glue that binds them all together. That's the DNA of the city. It's the routes, the subways, the public spaces, the parks. So I'd really like to share some experiences over my immersion in those two worlds of architecture and urbanism, now around 7 decades. And the theme perhaps that unifies the projects that I'll show, which jump from the past, the earliest projects to the present, is the theme of innovation. And what do we mean by innovation? Well, it's challenging the status quo. It's about change, and for me, it's about the use of technology for social good. It's about new ideas and methods, and in many cases, it's perhaps going back to basics, going back to the lessons of history. And where did that start? It started in the 1960s. And the 1960s was arguably the birth of the Green Movement, although it hadn't been named as the Green Movement then. It was very much a fringe activity. And as architects, we were part of that fringe and seeking to explore an architecture that would relate to that new awareness of the fragility of the planet, which was perhaps initially summed up by the Earthrise photograph taken on the Apollo 8 mission. But that coincided. That was 1968, and perhaps more than coincidence, 1 year later, Buckminster Fuller penned the operating manual for Spaceship Earth. And Silent Spring, Rachel Carson drew attention to not just the fragility of the planet, but rather the ecosystems that constituted it. And in the popular world, the Whole Earth Catalogue was the transition between the analog world and anticipated a digital future in terms of access to information. And cybernetics was perhaps the summing up something that had existed for some time, but the idea that a product, a design, was rooted in systems. And if you could bring together, in our interpretation as designers, if you could take separate systems and merge them, unify them, you could do more with less, you could improve performance. And perhaps in automotive terms, that was the Airflow, which was perhaps the first production car that would take the earlier concept of a chassis and a coachwork and bring the two together to make a single monocoque structure. Those principles would come together in one of the first buildings, which was an ultra-low-cost factory for semiconductors, which was the new digital world. So I'm talking now about the mid-1960s. And if I do a kind of cut-through perspective to show the systems that come together to make that building, then it would look something like this. And these colored elements, which you see buried in the floor, is anticipatory in that that floor slab is more than just the structure. It's got the reinforcing rods, but it's also got small bore pipes, so it's doing more than just the structure. It's heating and cooling as water pulses through it. And the corrugated kind of metal ceiling has the fluorescent light tube, so it's doing double duty. Interestingly, half a century later, more recently with the Apple headquarters, those technologies are still coming to the fore. And if I look at the interior of that building, there's a glass screen on the right, and this is the production line. So the other side of that glass screen is the management. And if the building was innovatory in terms of its systems, the way in which it came together, it was also socially revolutionary in that it was one single space, one entrance, one standard for management and workers. It didn't differentiate. This is what would have been built on the left if the owners had not decided to go in another direction. And my diagrams on the right sum that up. Typically, the factory of that time was the kind of dirty shed and the clean box. It was we and they, as opposed to a unified group. Socially, the most deprived area of London, and if that was the 60s, then I'm coming now to the early 70s. The most deprived area in London was Docklands, the London docks. And that was the scene of militancy. And this was a commission for a Norwegian shipping firm. And again, those parallel worlds of technological change and social change merged together. And the idea that in one building, revolutionary at the time, that those two elements of the workers, the management could come together under one roof. Technically, this was using a product which had never been seen in the UK before. It was a heat and light reflecting glass, high performance, bound together by gaskets. And the cut through again for that was that same systems thinking. So the light elements, the light fittings would be the extracts for the system of cooling and heating. So it would be heat recovery, and the structure would be the perforated plenum. And at the bottom level would be extraordinary facilities, like a luxury sports club, unheard of at that time, and offices with carpets, with planting, with art on the wall, with views. Again, it's very difficult to transport oneself back into that period in the 60s and 70s. What was the typical workspace? It was pretty horrific. So it gives, if it's revolutionary in the Docklands, it would have been revolutionary anywhere in the country at that time. There is a very close relationship in terms of innovation, sustainability, and the natural world, working with nature. And one of the earliest projects for that owners of that shipping line, a Norwegian shipping line, Olsen's, was an unbuilt project to relocate headquarters in a pine forest just outside Oslo. And here you can see the path through the forest. And the idea of the office headquarters being pavilions which would sit very lightly in the forest and not disturb it. And the cars would be held at bay. If I gave a verbal description of this project, it would be almost identical to the Apple headquarters, which I'll show later, built about 50 years later. And this cut-through model here is showing that it sits lightly in the forest, it doesn't disturb nature, and there are systems below ground which echo the very earliest sketches, which is the use of sunlight, mirrors which will reflect light directly into the depth of the interior, working with natural ventilation, a breathing building which is healthier, using less energy, recirculating water, and converting human waste to fertilizer. So at that time, quite revolutionary concepts, which were embodied then in the first built building of that period, which is a center for the visual arts in the University of East Anglia, housing an extraordinary private collection of Sir Robert and Lady Sainsbury. But instead of producing 3 buildings, one for a building of the Faculty of the History of Art, and the other for a common room restaurant, and another for the exhibition of the extraordinary collection, instead it is one roof which brings together and unites all those elements. And as you can see through this diagrammatic cross-section through the building, it's very much about working with the local climate which is always cool at night and displacing and bringing in cool air, circulating, saving energy, and again, a healthier building. And the diagram also indicates that if that is innovatory in its technology, then socially, and the way in which you might display works of art is perhaps the first museum or gallery where there are no walls on which to display works of art. Instead, it's a series of movable panels, vitrines, and signified by a tunable light box. So it can be filled with natural light or it can be tuned down. If the exhibition is dominant on works on paper, then the light levels can be reduced to more artificial light than natural light. So highly tunable. And that systems thinking, the analogy by the chance coincidence of the helicopter parked outside, a reminder that a helicopter, its systems are renewed over time, and the building likewise. So essentially demountable elements, you could change the mix of solid to void, you could change the panel system over time. And interestingly, that is being used almost right now as the university is converting to much more emphasis on renewable energy. So these panels will be changed and there will be PV panels harvesting energy. If I look at the back of the building and the access to the very discreet underground undercroft servicing this lightweight canopy above, then if it was revolutionary and innovatory as a museum, it heralded all the clues for reinventing the airport. So a reminder really of what the airport was in the 1990s. This is very typical. It's heavy servicing, moving air, essentially cutting out daylight. And if I took a slice through that building, then it would look something like this. You would see the image at the bottom, which is how you would experience it as a passenger. If you were on the roof, you'd see all this mechanical plant. You'd have to have scissor lifts to change the light fittings, and the replacement, the maintenance of the air conditioning, you'd have to get on the roof. So really, a gas guzzler in terms of energy consumption, quite grim as an experience and not exactly easy to maintain. So our move in terms of learning from that Sainsbury Centre model and translating that into a new kind of airport was almost to turn this upside down. And that transition then, the undercroft, like the Sainsbury Centre, has all the mechanical equipment. You can get at it very, very easily. And it's a lightweight canopy which admits the sun, so there's no dependence on electric, energy-consuming lighting. And it's an analog experience in a digital world, because you open up and you know where you are in terms of the airfield, the setting. I liken that in many ways, the old model, to the old model of an aircraft. It was a truss structure, as opposed to what I might say is one of the emblematic, one of the images of modernity, which is the cantilever, and which comes forth in a modern aircraft and is echoed in this structure. And here you can see this lightweight roof, which is full of natural light, calculated to bring in some deliberate shadowing on the floor to animate it. One of the difficulties of a roof which is so light is that the wind, the air currents over it can create an uplift. And interestingly, the edges of that learn from the world of aeronautics, in that there are spoilers on the edge to break down and create the turbulence and destroy the uplift. If that was reinventing the airport, then subsequently and right up to today, we're developing that model from Hong Kong to Beijing. Here's Beijing. The scale of the roof now much more like a kind of artificial sky. Another version of it, underground servicing, top light. This is Jordan. And more recently, Cambodia, which is, as you can see, under construction. It's not commissioned yet, but continues that exploration of how you best combine for the kind of magical spiritual properties of natural light, but continuing that quest to find a more energy-efficient building. There was the potential to make a quantum leap in terms of another reinvention, and that was what happens, this was Mexico Airport, what happens if you dissolve that roof into the columns? What happens if those columns become like funnels, and they funnel light and they handle water runoff, and just a hint of what that might look like internally. So a massive leap in terms of the spans, a doubling of the spans for more flexibility for the future. And architecture inescapably, and it could be another talk or discussion or sharing of experience, is very much in the political domain. And when that becomes a vendetta between current governments and incoming governments, between the left and the right, then that project got cancelled. It got cancelled at a stage in its construction where it would have been cheaper to have finished it than to have destroyed it. And this is that airport right now. It's a ruin. And more optimistically, if one moves into the next big airport of the future, which is a recent competition that we won, which is for Riyadh Air. And this is truly mega. And here, if we look at the history of an airport accumulates all kinds of other activities in a random sort of way. It becomes a mini city. So here, we're saying, accept it, it's a city. Design it as a city, not as a terminal from the start. So it's like a walled city, and running through the heart of it and connecting it with the center of Riyadh is a kind of an oasis. And that permeates through this kind of walled city. And the walled city, what do we learn from an architecture in the desert before an age of cheap energy electricity? When you can throw a switch, air conditioning kicks in. What are the lessons of a past architecture? Not as a nostalgic exercise, but to learn valuable lessons to improve the quality of life, reduce energy in terms of a desert architecture of the present. So the project is called Masdar. It's an Institute for Renewable Energy. It's in Abu Dhabi, and it's powered in part, and I say in part because it's only using 40% of the energy from this solar field, but it's active 24 hours, 7 days a week as an energy-intensive research center. Probably if I compare models, then interestingly, the heart of Dubai, which uses really models appropriate to a Western model of a city, is actually, because of all the black asphalt and the exposed glass and the spacing, is hotter than the desert that surrounds it. And if we go back in time to find the lessons of the past, shade, colonnades, vegetation, evaporative cooling, progressively bringing down the temperature, and then the dwellings themselves by screening and layering are coming down to a much more habitable 27 degrees. So if you could use those devices, if you could translate them in modern terms, and then add the solar, then you really are starting to make progress. And here, with Masdar on the right, we compare the scale of the traditional city and our new experiment exploring some of these ideas. And Masdar is really a combination of experiments. And here, in terms of shading, you can see the public spaces. The facades are two kinds of facades. Those which are residential, which are the desert-colored ones. They literally use the aggregate from the desert. They create lightweight panels. They're layered. And in the background, you can see the residential facades, which are Teflon cushions. So very lightweight, high insulating barrier. And the original cross-section envisaged, and this is something like 15 years ago that it became active, the idea of driverless vehicles that would induction charge and then at a lower level enable the streets to be scaled for the pedestrian with shading. And those operate today. Here you can see the induction charging pads for the vehicles that roam around and host the many tourists who continue to visit it. Also in Abu Dhabi, and working with the natural world, is the National Museum, Sheikh Zayed Museum, which is very much about the history of the Emirates. And as you can see, the sails are emblematic of falconry, of flight, and they mark the spaces below. These are already built, and they'll be commissioned next year, but I'm not allowed to show the photographs because they're embargoed until the building opens. And here you can see the diagram of how the ecology of the building works. And underneath you can see these pipes. And below the desert, it's always cool. So you pull the air through the cool earth, and it's already cooled. So how do you draw it out through the exhibition spaces? The idea is that these fins create heat. So they then trigger thermals, rising currents of air. And although I'm not allowed to show photographs of the exterior, the reality is that anybody can drive around this and photograph it. So this is not the rendering. This is really what it does like at the moment. And if you can imagine those thermals, those are the thermals that keep a sailplane aloft. And I realized here this was a sailplane that I, with another pilot, we set a UK speed record for a 300-kilometer triangle, which stood for some 12 years. It is, coincidentally, as you'll probably recognize, an Italian Caproni Calif A21 sailplane. And like the wings of any flying machine, the movement of the air speeding up on one side, creating a low-pressure area, is the principle that we've applied in many tall buildings, and particularly in the building popularly known as the Gherkin. So the difference between the high and low pressure, the wind coming from any direction, and the spiral of the atrium, which is the green lung, the breathing lung of the building, spirals around it. And here you can see that building in the cityscape. But our innovations on tall buildings start before practice. They start really traditionally with the first image that I showed, which is the Chrysler building. And interestingly, up to relatively recently, every tall building would be a version of that model. So it would be a central core of structure, of elevators, of bathrooms, mechanical plant, surrounded by a ribbon of space. And I challenged that as a student at Yale in the master's class in the early 1960s, 1961. And this building was later described by the dean of Yale as being the model that made possible the Hong Kong Bank, which was a competition in 1979. And what was revolutionary about this building, apart from its suspended structure and the breaking down the scale with kind of villages at the double heights as you go up the building, was the idea that there was no central core. The core is fragmented, it's on the sides, so that enables the space to be open. You can see the views through that space. And again, no coincidence, this became the first tall building that was able to take a dealer's floor, because a dealer's floor is dependent on line of sight. And with no central core, of course, you have infinite flexibility. It also means that without the central core at the base of the building, you can lift the whole building up, people can walk underneath it, which they do, and also you can create a cathedral-like banking hall right in the heart at the base of the building. So it's liberating. It's very much about the design. If I just give a glimpse of one or two other explorations in terms of tall towers, this is the Commerzbank building of the 1980s in Frankfurt, and those interruptions as you go up bring nature and air, fresh air, into the heart of the building, into the central atrium. And everybody has the combination of a view to nature and out to the city beyond. And if I bring the tall tower story more up to date, this is a building under construction for JP Morgan in Park Avenue, and the structure here is again an innovatory structure. It brings together the forces down on three critical points, avoiding the interruptions below onto the bedrock, and that cantilever enables the significant increase in public space over the previous building, which came down in a very traditional manner. So something like 2.5 times the amount of space at the public domain. And here you can see that building under construction. This is a simulation. No, this is an actual photograph, excuse me. And this is a simulation on the right of the kind of cathedral-like spaces, the social spaces that occur, the town hall space here at the intermediate level. And unusually a full city block, so you can see right through the building from Park Avenue to Madison, and the opportunity here, as in many buildings, to incorporate works of art as a fusion with the architecture. Gerhard Richter, the German artist, as you can see. Also a reminder that traditionally we associate the tall building with a kind of obsessive consumption of energy. So popularly, it's supposed to be the anti-green type of building. The reality in terms of the data is otherwise. So two Berkeley researchers looking at the carbon footprint of the East Coast and focusing here, the scale of high carbon is red and yellow. The color for low carbon and dramatically low carbon is the dark green. And interestingly, the dark green is Manhattan. And the reason why Manhattan is more sustainable than the sprawl which surrounds it is that it has a high dependence on public transport, it's compact, it's walkable, and that translates into a much more sustainable city model. If I show those kinds of buildings which by their nature, by their location, are tall because the buildings are, the communities, the cities are high density, then I'll show the polar opposite, where it's a lower rise, historic center. It's a market town in the northeast of England called Ipswich. And here, it's a new kind of building, which we called a ground scraper. So it's very deep, it goes to the edges of the site, it recreates the historic street pattern, so it's very friendly in civic terms. And if you looked from the street at night, at the time, which was, again, another innovation, the suspended glass wall, then you see a building which is essentially low and deep. And at the heart of that space is sunlight, natural light, and movement vertically by escalators, much more socially friendly than the traditional lifts, elevators. And those escalators connect the world at the base with the world at the top, which is a roof garden. And I perhaps spend more time and images on this project because it anticipated what is, I truly believe, the workplace of the future, which is very socially orientated and very much about lifestyle. And the lifestyle here was connecting an Olympic-size swimming pool at the base of the building with a roof garden at the top. And the point that was made earlier about designing for a future which is unknown, that systems approach here of incorporating a void in the floor. So the prefabricated floor was about building quickly, more economically, getting more value for money, but at the same time, future-proofing, something that, as somebody once said at the anniversary of this building, and this building is half a century old now, it celebrates its birthday next year. And when it opened, it was very much the world of the typewriter. And quite interestingly, I was shown in Flavio's office the extraordinary Valentine typewriter of the past. And at one anniversary, the kind of leaders of the company who had come out of retirement said something like, Norman was always talking about flexibility for the future, and it seemed to humor him, and it didn't seem to cost us too much more. But we never in our wildest dreams imagined that there would be the digital revolution, and we would be able to encompass that in our buildings when all the competitors had to really build anew. The more up-to-date version of that, a very recent project, but rooted in the same principles in the historic centre of London. So feeling that a tall building would not be appropriate, but a lower building, picking up the historic Roman route of the Watling Street and giving that the clue to break down the scale of the building, to create a colonnade within it. And here you can see the colonnade. What you don't see in detail is the public space that marks the end of that. And here, incorporating the work of an artist, Christina Iglesias, as a water feature. And again, very subtle, this doesn't tell you that this is about security, but it also is. It's not just a social gathering spot, but it's also protection against truck bombs, which are normally come as very, very ugly, intrusive structures. And so this, I should have explained perhaps in passing that those bronze gills that you saw on the outside were the elements which bring in air from the outside, which filter it and which noise attenuate it, reduce the noise level, and bring in deep into the heart of the space. Now, this again is quite revolutionary because this is uncharted territory. How do you move air naturally, and how do you, over its passage over that distance, temper it? And at the heart is the spiral that connects the bottom of the building to the top. And if we look at the entrance space at the bottom, that combines a work of art, which is the stainless steel kind of lake in the ceiling that connects with the ramp at the upper levels. And here it's bringing in natural light, it's extracting the air. And that air is pulled over a ceiling, which we invented for the project. And this ceiling is enabling all kinds of things to happen. Incidentally, this is called the pantry. And so the movement within the building is deliberately calculated for social contact. So if you work on the second floor, you still have to go through the pantry at level 10 and then drop down to the second floor. So all the visitors, the studios in Bloomberg, the Bloomberg headquarters in Europe are clustered here. And that ceiling is enabling, because of its acoustic properties, it's enabling another invention, which is a wooden floor. And that wooden floor is magneted, so it's above a total access floor, because a wooden floor is not normally associated with flexibility. And here we do come to some of the resolution of preferences, and Mike Bloomberg always loved the idea of having a wooden floor in an office, which is counterintuitive, because if you have open spaces and so on, then you have noise levels. But that is made possible by this ceiling, which is a series of metal aluminum petals. And those are configured so there's a lot of surface area. They're not just working acoustically. There are 500,000 LEDs throughout the building, so they're very efficient lighting fixture. And at the same time, they either go hot or cold, so that the air which is pulled over them is tempered. Now, I haven't talked about research, but just a glimpse into our research and the research of others related to the themes that I'm talking about. So here we built in a warehouse an installation using all those elements of the ceiling, and clustered around this space, and these individual workstations are simulated individuals. So we're reading the performance over different periods of the year, extreme temperatures, humidity. So it's really testing the validity of this concept, which worked not just for Bloomberg, but also, as I'll show you shortly, for Apple. The research of others that we have collaborated with, the Harvard School of Public Health, these are test cubicles, and the working conditions are simulated from a traditional building, office building, recirculating air through a central system, as opposed to some of the kind of buildings that I've described, which are pulling large volumes of fresh air, reducing the energy and creating a healthier environment. And it's this machine room below these spaces which makes that possible. And here's just a summary of the results. And as you can see, the conventional building is orange. The traditional building is the middle, is green, and the light green is a kind of super green building. So whether it's crisis response, whether it's strategizing, altogether higher performance and more and healthy. And coming to, and in many ways, if this is about handheld devices, it could also be true of buildings. And that leads us to the Apple campus. And the circle, which perhaps looks like a one-liner, took something like a year to evolve as there was a struggle between the curves of the ideal pod for programmers and the constraints of the site. So it was a kind of eureka moment some 9 or 10 months into the design process. It's difficult to get an idea of the scale. So if you were in the heart of that circle, then the scale is quite deceptive. You don't feel as if you're enclosed by a building. It's something almost on the rim of the horizon. And if you're walking around from the outside, then paradoxically, it's not the big building that the aerial view would suggest. And how do you put another building into that site? I'll be showing you shortly. But just a quick detail of that very familiar edge with the eyebrow, and that is, again, how that junction with the long curved glass panes brings the fresh air and filters it. And the Steve Jobs Theatre, we realized as a circular building, and perhaps the inspiration was a mini solid disc, almost like a flying saucer. And that was realized as a composite, the same technology as the sailplane that I showed, which is a vast disc which literally floats above a structural glass drum, so that 80 tons of roof and everything that's going up to the roof in terms of fire protection systems, water, electricity, is all going up through the joints in that glass, so that when you're under the entrance to the theater, then you have this complete weightlessness disc hovering like a flying saucer above with 360-degree views. The story in energy terms is totally self-sufficient as a building. And it recycled all of the original 24 buildings which occupied the site and which have been since transformed into this world of nature, planting 10,000 trees and something like 30 or 40,000 vegetation bushes and so on. So recycling, but recycling is not just materials. Recycling, perhaps the ultimately sustainable building, is a building which is recycled itself. And here the Reichstag is recycled. It was transformed in the interim period by Jean-Claude and Christo with its wrapping, and the cupola, which is emblematic of the democracy in action, illuminated at night, is also the clue to its ecological story, because it's a zero-carbon building and it's using all of the armory of sunshine, reflecting it deep into the heart of the building, using natural ventilation, thermal storage below the ground, co-generating with biomass, PVs, so all the familiar elements, and here in the 1990s. And that, of course, is the public space, the spiral, and voted for by the parliamentarians, the ability for the public who are answerable to the politicians to symbolically look down upon them in the debating chamber below. And that is the most visited parliament building with extraordinary queues, the attraction of the public space. And if that really is the transition between the architecture of a building and the infrastructure of public space, and that public space can be about the connections, the bridge, the blade of light, which is a new kind of suspension bridge, which is very, very low, doesn't intrude with the view. This is on the axis of St. Paul's. And if we translated that into a vertical cantilever, then as you referenced earlier, Flavio, the project of Collserola in Barcelona. And that was a competition, and right at the last moment, just before the presentation, I thought, how do we communicate the idea of what we've done? And in a hotel lobby with a small team, we produced these sketches which showed really what the conventional communication tower would be, which was really rooted in a massive concrete column. And of course, by using this suspension structure, we dematerialize that, and it virtually disappears as a structure. Again, doing more with less and balancing and minimum disturbance to nature, rather like the principles of that project in the Norwegian forest. And again, how do you respect an extraordinary landscape, the landscape of the Massif Central, and the main arterial, the main highway connecting Paris with Barcelona? When it comes to this extraordinary valley, then you're getting 5-hour delays, pollution, traffic at a standstill, and this was the response to that project. And just to give an idea of the scale, as it goes over 2.5 kilometers, it is the highest in the world. It's the same height as the observation deck of the Eiffel Tower. And perhaps just to give a feel of that, the 7 piers that march across the landscape, it's on a very gentle arc of 20 kilometers. So that curve, when you're driving across it, is a reference point. And the sides are transparent. So many times you're literally above the clouds. It's the closest you can get to flight in an automobile. So it's become not just the solution to traffic congestion. You can't measure the reduction in the carbon footprint by all the traffic, but just by the trucks alone. It's the equivalent in terms of taking 40,000 tons of CO2 a year out of the atmosphere, the equivalent of planting a forest of some 40,000 trees. If I change and I move to the reference earlier about the foundation, the Norman Foster Foundation, it has three elements. It has an archive, it has an educational program, and it also has a projects division. And just to give a hint of some of those activities, because the kind of things that the foundation can do are the sort of activities that it's very difficult, if not really impossible, for a practice to do, coming from a different direction and not having the commercial imperative. And so the projects are quite diverse, and I'm just going to show a tiny sprinkling. One is the collaboration with Airbus Materials Research, and I included this because the last moment of conversation with Flavia, myself, and you referred to the Nomos table, so I thought I'd just slip in the version which is now Cosmos, which again in the spirit of doing more with less, it's pared right down. It's the analogy perhaps between the bicycle frame that was steel and the carbon fiber, so really attenuated. And then the educational, and here, how do you break down the barriers between the different worlds, as it seemed to us, of design in everyday objects, architecture, and art. And so I was invited to demonstrate that theme through the foundation by the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. And one of the many posters features the automobile that we recreated as an homage to Buckminster Fuller, the Dymaxion car of 1934. I worked with Fuller for the last 12 years of his life, so this was a kind of homage and a reminder historically that these are of the same period, and the Dymaxion on the left uses the same chassis, the same engine, the same transmission as the Dymaxion car, the Ford sedan on the right, rather. And in many ways, this was the birth of the people mover. So it has larger volume, it's much faster, it consumes less fuel. It is the teardrop streamlined form. And again, the exhibition attracted a totally new audience. It broke all the records for the Guggenheim, but it broke a different kind of record in that the appeal of the automobile and mixing it with art and architecture created a new audience of who'd never normally go into a museum. And one of the things, for example, that I showed was that everybody expects the lunar lander being a great technical breakthrough between Boeing and NASA in the late 60s. But actually it was anticipated, as you probably know, by the Porsche Phaeton of 1906, which has the electric motors built into the hubs, like the lunar lander. And also drew attention to the fact that at the turn of the century, there were more automobiles powered by electricity than petrol in the turn of the century in New York. And of course, Ferrari had a pride of place in that lineup. Moving to a completely different kind of world education and a workshop in the foundation which focused on the plight of refugees, bringing together all the experts with a group of scholars from all over the world, and just noting that almost 10 million people are living in refugee camps. And the standard tents have a recommended 1-year life. And typically, statistically, a family will spend 17 years under a sheet of cloth or canvas or plastic. So what we did is that for the workshop, in anticipation of it, we got the most advanced tent, which is a collaboration with a Swedish firm of designers and IKEA, and it's called the Better Shelter. And we built it in the courtyard of the foundation. And if you can imagine that the team of us, and I was part of that team a few days before the scholars arrived for the workshop, and here we are trying to assemble that under a sunny sky in Madrid, and trying to imagine what it would be like doing it in monsoon conditions, in a climate catastrophe or whatever. So, and again, in this most sophisticated of tents, which has a 3-year life, this gives you an idea of what life might be like over approaching 2 decades. And so the students, not surprisingly, said there has to be something between a traditional building, which is going to take years, and a tent that you can put up, depending on the tent, whether that's 24 hours or 36 hours. And afterwards, the sponsors of that workshop approached the project team in the foundation. If that was, the workshop was in June of 2022, they approached us in August and said, could you hit a deadline to proof of concept, demonstrate the feasibility of building something very fast, very cheaply, but durable and permanent in time, 6 months' time, for the Venice Biennale. There were times when I never thought it was possible, but miraculously we did pull it off. And the clue to to the technology of that is the top right. It's a low carbon concrete impregnated canvas, which when you spray it with water, goes hard within a few hours, and 24 hours it's structurally rigid. And we use the age-old catenary arch. In other words, a builder in the past would hold a piece of string, it would define an arch, and if you stiffen that and turned it, then it would be your very beautiful catenary arch. And that, in the nick of time, we managed to get that together as a small pavilion. And what was interesting is that the assembled media, television crews, writers, this was designed for the most impoverished in society, the most vulnerable. And you had the most privileged in society saying, I love it, I want one of those, I'd like to spend the night in it, I'd like one in the bottom of my garden. And so you can see the lower parts of the arch are perfect in terms of showers, in terms of bunk beds, study, kitchen, and giving this central space. That, if it was a typical kind of refugee camp, then we started also to explore how you could create social spaces. And this is now the start of another journey, because that was seen by the government of Costa Rica. They have a housing issue, and they have extraordinary budget limitation. And we are now on course to hit that budget. This is a proof of concept. We were looking at this 2 weeks ago in Madrid, and we can deliver at scale of 500 a 2-bathroom, 2-bedroom living kitchen for $16,500, which has to be a record. And finally, the last bit, a course on cities, which brings together the whole issue of infrastructure. It's about the civic leaders of the future. It's about combining working with a city. In this instance, a 1-year master's course, the 3 cities, Athens, Bilbao, San Marino. It's about using technology, the means to be able to model, to create a digital twin of a city, and to be able to explore the implications in terms of carbon, quality of air, trees, planting, to explore that digitally, and also as a long-term community tool to encourage a bottom-up approach to civic planning. And here are the graduates celebrating their year. Thank you. Okay.
Norman, as far as I know, you have to leave now. Or you have time for some questions?
5 minutes.
Two, okay.
If my wife says so.
Are there any